Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. I am obsessed with Zhao Ziyang. I don't know what's triggered this re-obsession with him, but I cannot stop thinking about Zhao Ziyang for some reason. I know there's all this stuff going on with like Red Note, Xiaohongshu, whatever. I don't care. I don't care about that at all. That is so boring and uninteresting to me. This is so much more interesting, I promise. If you need a distraction from everything that's going on in the world, just sit back, relax, and let me tell you about this Chinese politician who died like 20 years ago, okay? So unfortunately for you, this is another one of those memory lane episodes where I have to explain to you this lecture that I took like 15 years ago and why it still has resounding significance to me today that I'm only just now understanding. Back in my undergraduate days, I had to take this like politics and governance course, which was run by a guy called Daniel Hammond, who is now head of Asian studies at Edinburgh University. So shout out to Dan. We had to read the autobiography of Zhao Ziyang. The name of the biography is Prisoner of the State. Great name. I didn't know anything about him, which goes to show how much extra reading I was doing during my undergraduate. I was hooked on this autobiography because it had everything. It had secrets of how the Chinese state was actually being run. It had like background information on the Tiananmen Square protests. It had secret tapes being smuggled out. It had subterfuge and infighting. It was so good. It's a really good book. If you have time to read it, I suggest you read it because it's very interesting. The other reason why his story is fascinating is because nobody really actually knows who he is, and this goes for inside and outside of China as well. If you ask the average person who is Zhao Ziyang, they're not going to know. And this is despite the fact that Zhao Ziyang was one of the very few general secretaries of the CCP that we've ever had. So we've had Guofeng, Zhao Ziyang, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. Zhao Ziyang is in there. He is technically the leader of the party, and yet nobody knows who he is. And today I'm going to tell you not only who he is, but also why we don't know who he is, and also try and get an idea of what China may have looked like if Zhao Ziyang had been able to hold on to power, which he never would have, for specific reasons that we are also going to discuss today. To get to this place, we have to talk about so many things. We have to talk about the reform and opening up era. We have to talk about the two whatevers. We have to talk about all the elders of the party. We have to talk about Deng Xiaoping. We have to talk about Hu Yaobang. We have to talk about Guofeng. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of names this episode. I will tell you, if you're coming from like the history episodes, you know what's up. But if you've just joined us recently, you're going to be very confused by all these names. I will try and indicate which names are worth remembering and which ones you can just like throw out the window. You will forget all of this as soon as you stop listening to this episode anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The Tiananmen Square protest also figures very heavily in this story, but we're not going to talk about in too much detail. This is not a Tiananmen Square episode. We never did one. Maybe we'll do one in the future. Who knows? But anyway, this is a Zhao Ziyang fan club episode, okay? So yeah, if you want to learn about this very obscure Chinese politician and what he means to the legacy of the CCP and almost kind of why China is the way it is today, like he is one of those contributing factors, then yeah, stick around. So let's start with a brief biography just to introduce you to the character. So Zhao Ziyang was born in 1919. He was born to a landlord family. So even though he was from a rich family, he still joined the CCP in 1938, and he went on to fight in the PLA. Interestingly, his father was actually killed during land reform. I don't know to what extent Zhao Ziyang actually knew about this at all. He wasn't on the Long March, so it's not like he was stuck in the mountains. I don't know where he was when his father was killed, and that information isn't readily available. But if anyone knows any details about that I think that would be really interesting to add to as like a point to why his psyche was the way that it was. But anyway, father killed during land reform. He joins the PLA. After 1949, he takes up a number of various like provincial positions, right? So he goes to serve in Guangdong province, and then during the Cultural Revolution, like pretty much everyone else, he is purged. Then he is rehabilitated in 1971, goes to serve in Inner Mongolia, of all places, and then he moves to Sichuan province, where he becomes like the party secretary of Sichuan province. So he's in charge of running Sichuan province. And it's at this point where we start to see Zhao's real character in terms of what he feels is important for the future of China. So by the time he gets to Sichuan, China is just coming out of like the high tide of the Cultural Revolution, right? So Mao Zedong has passed away, and it's kind of opening, even though the Gang of Four is still hanging around and we don't know what's going to happen to them yet, it's kind of like the time of experimentation in China, okay? China has many different paths it can go down, and different people are trying out different things. And so as party secretary of Sichuan province, Zhao Ziyang tries a more reformist route. So his main goals for Sichuan at this time were to get grain output to go up by 55%, peasant income to go up by 80%, and total industrial output to go up by 180% between 1977 and 1985. Also, by 1985, Sichuan was to build one Daqing-type oil field, one Anshan-type iron and steel complex, and two Kailuan-type coal mines. Zhao also called for the principle of distribution according to work and for ensuring that peasants actually benefited economically from their labours. He criticised local authorities for neglecting peasant interests and taking too much grain from them. Additionally, he favoured freedom within the collective and strongly supported increased incentives and increased benefits for the peasantry. Apart from his economic openness, he was also a supporter of the new political theory that was coming into trend, named seeking truth from facts. This is something that's often attributed to Deng Xiaoping. Put a pin in that because we're going to get to that in a minute. But basically, he was using this political theory to justify putting new ideas into action, because the basic principle of seeking truth from facts is that you cannot rely on theory alone. You have to put things into practice first to test the theory to see whether or not it works. It's basically just logic. Like the idea of seeking truth from facts is like, hey, have you actually tried that to see if it works before, I don't know, destroying the entire country over it? Just an idea. In general, he was in favour of decentralisation of political power so that provinces were able to make more autonomous decisions, as well as opening up provinces to foreign input, so things like foreign direct investment, foreign technology. He wanted industries to be able to kind of make their own rules, or at least try things out, be less tied to the state-owned enterprise system, and also to lower taxes to incentivize more creativity. In 1986, David Buckman wrote, Zhao is attempting to formulate a synthesis that increases productivity and allows China to achieve the four modernizations. He wants to develop a system that allows for strict control over finances and investment, and that stimulates enterprises to adopt new technology and improve productivity at the same time. His prospects for success in this mighty endeavor would not appear to be very great. If he can pull it off successfully, however, he will truly be one of the great reformers in Chinese history. However, Zhao was never able to take up this mantle as a great reformer in Chinese history. Although he proved to be a very inspirational leader at the time and was an agent of change in the Chinese both economic and political system, he has basically been forgotten by history. His achievements have been erased, his memory has been completely wiped. And this was done by the person he thought he could trust the most. That's right, there is intrigue and backstabbing. To understand why Zhao Ziyang was memory holed and made to live in exile in his home until 2005 when he died, we first need to talk about how exactly, or sort of where exactly he fit in the whole party apparatus. And in order to do that, we need to talk about the formation of the post-Cultural Revolution, post-Mao government. And to do that, we need to talk about Deng Xiaoping versus Guofeng. So after the death of Mao, after the Cultural Revolution, after the trial of the Gang of Four, you kind of have this leadership contest between the Maoists, if you will. So this is a faction led by Guofeng, and the Reformers, which is a faction led by Deng Xiaoping. Now, the Maoists had a huge leg up in this situation. Guofeng had basically been groomed for power by Mao Zedong since the 1960s. Even though he wasn't a particularly remarkable person himself, he was very, very loyal to Mao. He had been in charge of putting down a lot of rebels during the Cultural Revolution. In 1971, he became a member of the State Council. And then in 1973, he was made a member of the Politburo of the CCP. Finally, he became vice premier in 1975, and according to Michael Schonels, some of the remarks made by Mao on the eve of the Limbiao accident in 1971 could in retrospect be used to indicate that Hua was already at that time on Mao's shortlist of possible proletarian successors. With gentle irony, Mao had chided Hua for concentrating too much of his energy on agriculture and gone on to suggest that he become a generalist rather than a specialist by concentrating on the east, west, south, north and centre, party, government, military, popular and educational affairs. Hua's subsequent transfer to Beijing and the pattern of his career in the capital had undoubtedly been an attempt to groom him for some kind of higher office, and most important of all, there was his appointment to the first vice-chairmanship of the CCP in the spring of 1976, and Mao's political testament that read, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Deng was like the opposite of whatever Hua Guofeng was doing to put Mao at ease. Deng had been a thorn in Mao's side since the end of the Great Leap Forward, where Deng and some other people like Chen Yun had essentially taken over and tried to reverse a lot of Mao's policies in order to bring stability and bring an end to the famine. The Great Leap Forward was actually orchestrated, some would say, as an attempt by Mao to actually get rid of or sideline people like Deng Xiaoping, who were basically against Mao and trying to stop what he saw as the true revolution of China. He was denounced as a capitalist raider, and he was sent off to like Jiangxi for 5 years before he was rehabilitated just before Mao's death. But even though Mao was there when he was rehabilitated, he was still like, we can't trust this guy. I don't trust this guy. So it was hard for Deng to say that he was a legitimate successor to Mao when he was basically his number one denouncer throughout most of his career. This was compounded by an editorial that came out that was supported by Hua Guofeng and all of his followers that basically said that whatever Mao Zedong had said was correct, right? So it was kind of like a statement, if you will, or like a theoretical line within the party that said that the CCP should resolutely defend whatever party decisions Chairman Mao made and steadfastly abide by whatever instructions Chairman Mao gave. This became known as the two whatevers. Terrible name. Luckily, Deng Xiaoping was able to kind of counteract this sort of prevailing theory through something called the Seeking Truth from Facts line. So in May of 1978, an article called "Practice is the Sole Criterion of Truth" was published in the People's Daily and some other articles. I'm not going to go through exactly what it says. I will provide a link if you want to read the whole thing for yourself. It's quite repetitive, but basically what it is saying is that the only way to test out a theory to see if it is correct is to put it into practice. So there's nothing wrong with having theories, but it will remain a theory and we cannot call it a truth until we actually put it into practice and see if it works. So this undermines Hua Guofeng's two whatevers theory because it basically says that you shouldn't blindly follow whatever people say, even if those people happen to be kind of like of demigod status within your nation. Now, for some reason, this article broke the CCP. It's kind of complicated. There's a lot of theoretical sort of infighting and a lot of talking. It's a lot of people talking. The CCP is a very... If you're not into like politics and political theory, it's quite difficult to pass out why exactly two competing lines of thought might end up being the thing that gets one person supreme power of the entire country and the other person embarrassingly demoted. But essentially, the article itself wasn't written by Deng. It was written by somebody at the Central Party School of the CCP. The Central Party School isn't technically a political body, but it is where a lot of people who go on to have very powerful positions are trained up and sort of develop their modes of thought. And at this time, it's run by a guy called Hu Yaobang. This is an important name. Please remember this. Hu Yaobang, no relation to Hu Jintao. Even though this article was published by leading CCP-sponsored state media, it was seen by many in the party as a problem, as it was sort of slyly attacking Mao Zedong thought, Hua Guofeng thought, all of the Maoist side of the party, essentially. And the propaganda department was basically gearing up to try and counteract this article. However, Deng Xiaoping then weighed into the argument as well. Deng Xiaoping is what we would call an elder of the party. So China being a very Confucian hierarchical society, the older people are, especially within the CCP, where like the older people basically went through hell and back, they carry a lot more weight, right? Their word carries a lot more weight. So when they speak, everyone stops, everyone listens. So Deng Xiaoping gives his famous Seeking Truth from Facts speech a month later, which basically reiterates what the article says. And then according to Shonals, this is the sort of catalyst for deciding where the chips fall in terms of future leadership of the party. What eventually settled the issue in favour of the proponents of practice was a direct intervention by the PLA. On the 24th of June, the Liberation Army Daily, controlled by the Secretary General of the CCP Military Affairs Commission, Luo Ruiqing, published a second special commentators article by Hu Yaobang's ghostwriters. In A Most Basic Principle of Marxism, the point that practice constituted the sole criterion of truth was forcefully reiterated. Over the next few months, party committees throughout China one by one fell in line with Hu Yaobang and Deng Xiaoping. Political actors like Wang Dongxing and Guofeng, who hitherto had claimed legitimacy on the basis of the two whatevers, found themselves in a very precarious situation. Less than a year before, their references to what Chairman Mao once said had constituted powerful arguments in their own right. Now, they were at best worth only a fraction of whatever could be put in terms of truth on the base of extended testing in practice. Events at the third plenum of the 11th CCP Central Committee bore out the new balance of forces. The plenum formally downgraded the importance of the word by banning the practice of referring to the pronouncements of individual leaders as instructions. So in December of that year, there's a big meeting, and Hua Guofeng is in all but title ousted from power. He's still chairman of the CCP until 1981, but they basically just demote him, which is kind of rude because like he doesn't even get the special treatment of like having a trial and like being ousted from power or being like, you know, formally dressed down by everyone in the party where everyone goes around and makes a little speech about you. He is just like ignored, which is kind of worse. So because Deng Xiaoping's theoretical line wins out, so too does Deng Xiaoping, if that makes sense. It's a big shortcut, but that's basically all we need to know for the purposes of this episode. This is all taking place in December of 1978. At this same meeting in December of 1978, Zhao Ziyang is brought from wherever he is in Sichuan, and he is made Premier of China. If we go back to when we were talking about Zhao's plans for Sichuan before, he had managed to do quite a lot of work in the time that he had been premier, provincial secretary, party leader, whatever, while he was there. And this had impressed Deng Xiaoping so much that he was then brought to the centre to be part of the central government. It's important to note here as well that Zhao Ziyang had never been a Beijinger, so like he had never been someone with like lots of roles in Beijing who had lots of connections, because that's usually the way that people get to high positions of power in the CCP. He was very much a provincial guy, and his only ally, more or less, or like the only person that he really knew, was Deng Xiaoping. There is a line of thought put forward by people like Roderick Mukfarquhar that the reform and opening up, the special economic zone things, everything that happens in the late 80s, 1992 sort of time, this was all actually Zhao Ziyang's idea, right? So this had been started when he was leader of Sichuan, trying to bring in rural reform, trying to bring in more foreign technology, and was kind of formalized by Deng Xiaoping, but not really until after Zhao Ziyang had been removed from power. Deng is normally seen as the architect of reform. Certainly without his strong initial push for the reform and opening up to the outside world, there would have been no such program. Thereafter, he remained among the elders, the godfather of the effort, ready to sally forth from seclusion to defend it against all comers. But reading Zhao's unadorned, unboastful account of his stewardship, it became apparent that it was he, rather than Deng, who was the actual architect of reform. It was Zhao who, after countless inspection tours, finally realised the commitment to rural collectivization, reaffirmed when Deng came to power in 1978, was passé, and who threw his support for a national household responsibility system as the way to develop agriculture and raise farm incomes. As Zhao acknowledges, without Deng's support, it would never have been possible to proceed, but Deng did not make the conceptual breakthrough. Zhao did. It was Zhao too who conceived of the hugely successful coastal development strategy. This was not the special economic zone policy launched early in the reform era. Rather, it was an effort to mobilize all the coastal provinces to develop an export-oriented economy, importing large quantities of raw materials, transforming them, and then exporting the results in equally large quantities. There were many different kinds of objections that Zhao overcame, but again, once he convinced Deng, it was relatively smooth sailing. Zhao devised the policy in 1987 to 1988, and it outlasted his political demise, but thereafter it was no longer referred to as the coastal development strategy because the phrase was so closely linked to Zhao and no credit could be allowed to go to him. So 2 things to note from that passage. First of all, Zhao Ziyang is very reliant on Deng Xiaoping's support, even though he is premier of China, which means he is technically in charge of the economy regardless. And secondly, even though a lot of the ideas were Zhao's, names were changed, ideas were played with because they are not allowed to be associated with his name after his political demise. And you can see that reflected in things like if you go on Baidu and you look up Zhao Ziyang's profile, it's very short and it basically just said yeah, he was general secretary, but he made a lot of mistakes, so, and it doesn't attribute anything else to him. So they're very careful to preserve sort of Deng Xiaoping's image as architect of reform, while people like Zhao Ziyang have to be sidelines because of political mistakes that they made. Zhao Ziyang most definitely has ops during this period. There are lots of people who do not agree with him, lots of people who are trying to undermine his reformist ideas. Some of those people we've met before, people like Chen Yun and Li Xianyan, who we met during the Maoist episodes. So they are both economics people. Chen Yun was known for being very cautious. He came up with a model known as the birdcage economy, basically keeping a very tight lid on the idea of market economic forces. And then you have someone like Li Xianyan, who was finance minister under Mao, but who also sided with Deng Xiaoping in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward. But he was still a conservative by the time it came to the 1980s, which is completely understandable. He didn't like Zhao at all. They were not friends. He was very much wedded to the past successes or the past achievements of China's economy and how they contributed to the current growth. So according to Zhao Ziyang, he would say things like, the economic successes are not all the result of reform. Weren't there successes in the past too? Weren't the foundations laid in the past? But because Li was an elder, nobody stuck it to him. So Li grumbled on about Zhao's fixation with foreign stuff, his willingness to learn from what had been successful for the Asian tiger economies and even from the West. Li was the most prominent opponent of reform, and according to Zhao, he hated me because I was implementing Deng Xiaoping's reforms, but since it was difficult for him to openly oppose Deng, he made me the target of his opposition. Zhao was very much sheltered from political infighting by Deng Xiaoping and also by Hu Yaobang. So Hu Yaobang, after Guofeng is deposed, Hu Yaobang is made general secretary of the party. So you've got Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang working together kind of under Deng Xiaoping's protection or his tacit approval, if you will. So as a trio, I won't go over it in too much detail, but everyone's kind of familiar with the economic miracle of China and how it begins with the 1980s. Just to give some general stats for this period, because it's a very specific period, private farming and price reforms, something known as two-track pricing, are introduced. Between 1978 and 1984, value of agricultural output nearly triples to 7.1%, and the average GDP growth between 1980 and 1990 was 9.5%. By 1989, China became the world's 13th largest exporter, and its share of world trade almost doubled during this period. Between 1978 and 1990, the average annual rate of trade expansion was above 15%, more than 3 times higher than that of total world trade. In 1984, Zhao Ziyang visited the US, signaling to the rest of the world that China was open for investment. In 1979, inflows of foreign direct investment were zero. In 1986, they were around $1.8 billion. With the development of China's economy also became social and cultural changes, including the development of a more materialistic society. Jonathan D. Spence, who is basically my favourite writer in this period, he's got a very good book called The Search for Modern China, which if you're interested in sort of the end of the Qing dynasty up until the transformation of China up until the year 2000 essentially is a really good resource. He talks about the contrast during the 4 musts and the 8 bigs during this period, which I think is a very good indicator of how society had changed at this time. The 4 musts that had set the outer limit of materialist yearnings under Maoism had been a bicycle, a radio, a watch, and a sewing machine. In the new world of Deng Xiaoping, they were replaced by the 8 bigs: a colour television, a refrigerator, a stereo, a camera, a motorcycle, a suite of furniture, a washing machine, and an electric fan. But even though society had transformed into somewhere more materialistic, that's not to say that the way that society operated, the way that people were able to engage in the transformation of their lives, in choosing or deciding how their country was run, had changed at all. According to Wang Yuqing, in China, the CCP monopolizes not only power, but also avenues of social mobility. In the reform period, individuals can seek wealth through self-enterprising efforts, but party-state officials still wield enormous power. In a country permeated by paternalism, nepotism, and backdoor guanxi, the loss of political power may mean the loss of everything. The structural incentives in the enlistment of party-state functionaries are almost unlimited. In the reformist era, the political opportunities have been transformed into economic opportunities. So, economics is still connected to politics at this time very closely. Obviously, the economy is still centrally planned. The state controls the economy, but this also means that there's the reverse relationship, if you will. So actual financial power, actual economic power, growth, all of these things is still determined by how much political connection that you have. There is still the opportunity to become middle class, but you still have to have the correct politics. This creates a problem because those without political power are going to become frustrated because they are less socially mobile. That for them, culture and society is changing around them, but they can't participate as freely as they would want to. And they can see people taking advantage of these new economic changes, maybe not as legitimately as they would purport to do. So according to Spence, the new economic incentives had led to a documented and alarming rise in economic crime. Some 14,700 criminal cases were reported to have occurred in state grain bureaus alone between 1983 and 1984, involving the embezzlement of 15 million yuan in cash, around $4 million, and millions of bushels of edible grains and oils. The grain rats who committed these crimes were zealously hunted down and the worst offenders executed. At least 30,000 other economic crimes, the results of bureaucracy and malfeasance, had cost the state a further 88 million yuan. So you've got the financial crimes and frauds that are being perpetrated by those with political power, but just generally in the 1980s, all of these other latent issues were beginning to bubble to the surface. With change comes trouble, obviously, but it was the way in which the party was dealing or not dealing with these issues that were really causing problems for members of the public. In 1985, it appeared suddenly as if all the inherent tension and promise of the post-Mao era came together. In almost every sphere of Chinese life, there were contradictory signals, allowing all points of view to claim confirmation in reality. Agricultural production, the one-child family, industrial incentives and special economic zones, intellectual expression, relations with the United States and Soviet Union, the paring down and restructuring of the party apparatus and the army, the legitimacy of public protests. Each of these was, often in combination, a focus of national attention and source of disagreement. Those peasants who had thrived in the collective structure of the communes and production brigades, who believed the political rationalization for that form of social and economic organization to be convincing, and who considered the communes the main benefit brought by China's long and bloody revolution, now found that they had to abandon their former lives and go into contract farming with their families, or on their own if they had no families. Initially almost forgotten in the race for new entrepreneurial arrangements in the countryside were the residue of millions of urban youth sent to rural areas over the previous decades who had not been permitted to return home. Some had been radical Maoists and had found meaning in the commune system. Now they were simply exiles from their homes and families. The men often unable to find wives locally because of their uncertain status. In 1985, hundreds of Chinese who had marched as youngsters to Shanxi to serve Mao Zedong in the countryside returned to Beijing illegally. Defying the ban on such activities, they staged a sit-in on the steps of the CCP headquarters and appealed to Deng Xiaoping to hear their case. Many problems also hampered the reform in the industrial sector. Excessive bureaucracy and egalitarianism were prevalent still. The negative effects of economic development were also becoming clearer. In the summer of 1985, the government announced the first bankruptcy case to occur in China since the nationalization of the economy in the 1950s. You have all of these sort of problems, right? They're not huge problems, it's not things breaking down completely. It's not famine like you had in the 50s and 60s, but there are still all of these issues. And now, because people can sense that times are different, people feel that they have the freedom to complain about these issues in a way that they didn't before. People are not being watched as closely. People have a little bit more freedom of movement, a little bit more freedom of thought. This is also being reflected by the party itself when you have people actively contradicting Mao, like in the Seeking Truth from Facts article. There were plays and songs and articles being circulated that actively criticized the CCP, and there were even people making active calls for democracy, which is like completely unheard of in communist China. People were annoyed that there were technically local elections that had been set up, but these were still all state controlled. The people who were elected were chosen by the state first. People still didn't feel like they had enough participation in their own governance. So in 1986, you get kind of the first set of demonstrations. On December 20th, 1986, at least 30,000 students marched in Shanghai, parading through the People's Square and the Bund, where the party and government offices were housed in massive stone buildings raised long before British financial firms. The students were joined by an estimated 30 to 40,000 town people. Among the banners, the most common proclaimed the "Long live freedom and give us democracy." The main demonstrations proceeded without harassment by police, but students attempting sittings at municipal buildings were forcibly removed. Other protests were reported in Kunming, Chongqing, and Shenzhen economic zone. Some students in Shanghai had prepared a brief manifesto recalling in tone and content the one put forward by the May 4th demonstrators so long before, which the students now printed on 3 by 5 inch slips of paper and handed out to the crowd. To our countrymen, our guiding principle is to propagate democratic ideas among the people. Our slogan is to oppose bureaucracy and authoritarianism and strive for democracy and freedom. The time has come to awaken the democratic ideas that have long been suppressed. Now, this is completely radical. They're literally calling for actual democracy and an end to authoritarianism, which is what the CCP is. It's an authoritarian state. So this is a direct challenge to the government by young people. Again, as Spence writes here, a reflection of the May 4th movement. This is where we start seeing cracks in the leadership of the CCP. There are people like Zhao Ziyang, who is premier at this time, who's like, it's fine, it's fine. Just let them express themselves. They're fine. They're just young people. They're having a good time. It's whatever. We were doing the same thing back in the 30s. Nothing bad happened, right? Whereas there are high-ranking people who are also elders in the party who don't like what they see, and people who are conservatives who are still sort of living in fear of things like the Cultural Revolution, who are not happy about this, and they're looking for someone to blame. And unfortunately, in this case, that person happens to be Hu Yaobang. So the dismissal of Hu Yaobang is an important episode, not only in the eventual dismissal of Zhao Ziyang, but also in the Tiananmen Square protest story in general, because it's kind of like the first domino, if you will. It's also like a forewarning, like no matter how Deng Xiaoping likes you or doesn't like you or supports you or put you in your position or whatever, there's still potential for your political mistakes to undermine everything else that you've done. Even though Deng Xiaoping trusted Zhao and Hu to work together to reform China's economy, Deng and Hu Yaobang often had a lot of friction when it came to the reformist sort of liberalizing trend within the party. So if you remember, if we go back to the Seeking Truth from Facts article, it was someone within Hu Yaobang's coterie that came up with that and that wrote that. And apparently Hu Yaobang had actively been part of the editorial process of that article. Deng Xiaoping didn't want this liberalizing trend among intellectuals to go too far, and in the 1980s he introduced something called the Anti-Spiritual Pollution Campaign, which was essentially an anti-Western campaign by conservatives to curb what they called bourgeois excesses. Hu Yaobang wasn't really a huge fan of this. He never really promoted it that much, and according to one source within the party, apparently in 1984 Deng Xiaoping had said that Yaobang has displayed a weakness that is a fundamental shortcoming, and that weakness against liberalization is a fundamental shortcoming in a general secretary. Zhao Ziyang, in his autobiography also hints that Deng Xiaoping was planning to get rid of Hu Yaobang anyway by 1986. Hu Yaobang had essentially given an interview where he called Deng Xiaoping old, which I feel like was a fundamental mistake. He basically says, Zhao Ziyang and I are busy with economic and party affairs. The army is a place for the observance of seniority. So right now, with no water fight, we let Xiaoping have this position. That way, Ziyang and I can concentrate on managing the economic and party affairs. Crazy thing to say, in my opinion, but like maybe he was feeling confident, clearly. So when the protests broke out in 1986, this was essentially like the final straw for Hu Yaobang. Like, he'd used up all his goodwill, and Zhao Ziyang in his memoir recalls a conversation between him and Deng Xiaoping and a few other high-ranking people where the blame was placed squarely on Hu's shoulders. The student demonstrations that have taken place recently have not happened by chance. They are the result of lax control over bourgeois liberalization. He named the dissident astrophysicist Feng Liju and liberal writer Wang Ruowang, and then blamed Hu Yaobang for neglecting to expel Wang Ruowang from the party. He'd asked him to do so long ago. Why had it not been done? As for the demonstrations, he proposed firm measures to quell them, even if that meant resorting to the means of dictatorship. Put a pin in that. In 1986, Deng Xiaoping says that in order to stop demonstrations, we can use dictatorial methods. And he is the head of the CCP military at the time. So just put 2 and 2 together there. Retain this information. So Hu Yaobang is dismissed at this point, and then Deng Xiaoping makes Zhao Ziyang general secretary of the party. Zhao Ziyang does not want this position because he was happily tinkering away with the economy, and this was going to ruin his vibe, basically, because he would actually have to deal with politics, and he didn't want to admit that he low-key agreed with Hu Yaobang and not Deng Xiaoping and the other elders of the party. Zhao, I wouldn't say he was fearful of retribution of people like Li Xianyan and Chen Yun. I think he was just very aware that he had opposition within the party and that they would take advantage of any mistakes that came, either political or economic, and they did. So, for example, one problem that was emerging after the Hu Yaobang dismissal was a rapid rise in inflation. Inflation, which had been around 20% in the year 1988, was up to 26% or more in urban areas by the year's end. Living standards fell for many in the cities, and retrenchments in the capital projects ordered by the government threw many out of work. Panic buying and hoarding affected a wide range of products, from grain and edible oils to toothpaste and soap. In his autobiography, Zhao explains that this hoopla with inflation, which he admits was his own mistake, basically gives the conservative factions within the party fuel to undo some of the reforms that he'd been working on. For a time, rural regions had been free to make their own choices about crops after fulfilling state procurement quotas, whether or not to plant, how much to plant. These rights were also abolished. All of this reverted into state planning. The coastal development strategy that had just been proposed and was about to be launched was entirely scrapped. It marked the complete comeback of the old system and a great setback for reform. Power was concentrated in a few hands in the State Council and a few agencies of the Central Committee. In order to control loans and credits, withdrawals on ordinary people's savings were frozen. Only deposits were allowed. As they proceeded with this form of adjustment and reorganization, the economy quickly went into a dive. Markets slumped and production stagnated. If not for the non-state-owned sector of family businesses and joint ventures, the entire national economy could have fallen into extreme adversity. Another character that we have to add into the story at this stage is a guy called Li Peng. Li Peng is at some point the premier of China, but in general, his role is to just be like an antagonist for Zhao Ziyang. And he participates in a lot of activities with the other elders like Li Xianyan, who, as I mentioned before, did not like Zhao, never liked Zhao, would never like Zhao, in denouncing him. After the 13th People's Congress in 1987, Li Xianyan openly denounced me in Shanghai and Hubei in front of officials. He accused me of not carrying out socialism and of having learned too much foreign stuff. He said I had no understanding of economics and had brought chaos to the economy. Comrade Chen Yun was more discreet and made reasoned arguments. They later came to the conclusion that I was more Hu Yaobang than Hu Yaobang, not something that you want to have on your record. Before the panic buying, they had secretly tried to undermine me. When these developments took hold, they believed their chance had arrived, since they thought that I had ruined the economic policy and spoiled reforms. They spread adverse opinions about me and waged a campaign to overthrow Zhao. I was not well informed, since I had spent so many years working at local levels and had only recently come to the central leadership. I had fewer channels. Some of the behind-the-scenes dealings remained obscure to me even now. For example, a group of people wrote a letter to Deng Xiaoping attacking me, but I don't know who they were. Before the incident of June 4th, amid the Overthrow Zhao campaign, Deng Xiaoping had always firmly supported me and was not moved by their attempts to sway him. So Zhao Ziyang is not naive about the fact that there are people who don't like him, or that there are people who are actively trying to throw him out of power, just like they had done to Hu Yaobang, so that they could gain control of China for themselves and get Deng Xiaoping, who is like the ultimate supreme elder, on their side. But there's just nothing that he can do about it because he is not connected, right? He doesn't have a gang. Essentially, the only person he has is Deng Xiaoping. The only person he had before was Hu Yaobang, and we saw what happened to him. So this is the precarious situation that Zhao Ziyang is, despite being General Secretary of the party in 1988. So we're moving into 1989, and as I mentioned, this is not a Tiananmen Square protest episode, but obviously, the Tiananmen Square protests are the things that triggered the dismissal of Zhao Ziyang. And the reason that I had mentioned Hu Yaobang in such detail before is because Hu Yaobang is the reason, sort of, that the Tiananmen Square protests were triggered in the first place. According to Zhao Ziyang, in his memoir, this is the reason that the Tiananmen Square protests broke out. First, Hu Yaobang has always had a very good public image. He was responsible for reversing numerous cases of unjustified prosecution following the Mao years. He has always been a proponent of reform. Most important, he was incorruptible while in power. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with corruption, so commemorating Hu Yaobang provided a chance to express this discontent. Sorry, I actually forgot to mention this. Hu Yaobang dies. Hu Yaobang dies, and people think that it's caused by, like, there's not like reasons given. People think that it's like caused by stress or whatever, and people are not allowed to publicly mourn him the way that they wanted to, and so this is the reason that Zhao Ziyang is speculating that the protests began. Sorry, I forgot to add that detail. Secondly, many people were displeased or even outraged by Hu Yaobang's demotion in 1987. Many people were averse to the anti-bourgeois liberalisation campaign and continued to oppose it. In addition, people found it unacceptable the way in which the leadership was changed. In general, people were expressing a feeling of indignation over how Hu Yaobang had been treated. Third, when the government's reorganisation was proposed in the fall of 1988, programmes for reform had been cut back on all fronts. No action had been taken on political reform, while economic reform had been brought to a standstill or even retracted. Students were dissatisfied with the general situation and were expressing their desire for advancing reforms through their commemoration of Hu Yaobang. There were three kinds of people who took to the streets. The vast majority of people belonged to this category I described. There were also those who held grievances against our past policies and were taking the opportunity to make some noise. Of course, there was also a small number of people who opposed the party and opposed socialism and were hoping to aggravate the situation. So what Zhao Ziyang is saying here is that not only were people upset about Hu Yaobang's death, they were also upset about the rolling back of the economic reforms that Zhao Ziyang was in charge of. So basically, whether or not it's true, in the mind of Zhao Ziyang, the people of China are on the side of the reformers. Even though the reforms had problems, there were problems with inflation, people were generally happy with the course of change and were looking forward to, a bit like the rest of the world, how economic reforms might also bring about political reform, or at least an opening up, like a greater freedom of expression, that sort of thing. The problem was with the conservative factions who kept trying to claw things back, kept trying to get rid of Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, and with that, all the progress that they had made. This was what was frustrating the people from the perspective of Zhao Ziyang. And he goes on to say, "At a Politburo Standing Committee meeting, I said that we should not forbid the activities of the students who were merely holding their own commemorations while the Central Committee was holding memorial services. There was no reason why we should reserve for ourselves exclusive rights to commemorate Hu while forbidding the students to do so. I suggested we punish according to law only those who engage in the 5 types of behaviours: beating, smashing, looting, burning and trespassing." So Zhao Ziyang is pro-peaceful protest. This is, again, important. This is at the very beginning of the protest, way before June. This is like April. It's interesting because even in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, where Zhao Ziyang himself was purged, he still believes that people should have the right to express themselves. It's not just the party who should dictate how people feel, how people behave, how society is formed. The people themselves should have some should have avenues to express their disapproval of the party and the actions that they take. So Zhao Ziyang actually engages in dialogue with students. He persuades a lot of them to go back to their campuses. Things kind of calm down. This is all in April. At this time, Zhao Ziyang is also planning to visit North Korea for like a state visit or something. And so at this point, Zhao is like, would you mind not shooting anyone while I'm gone, please? Like, can we keep it calm? I'm going to North Korea. I'll be back in like 2 weeks, okay? And they're all like, yeah, that's fine. No problems. But the people who had been plotting against Zhao Ziyang anyway saw his visit to North Korea as the perfect opportunity to take advantage of his absence to escalate things with the students. The main aim of people like Li Peng, who I've mentioned, was to essentially convince Deng Xiaoping that this was not just like a random assortment of students or whatever who were like trying to express their grievances, but it was like an organized plot to undermine and even bring down the CCP. So this is what Zhao Ziyang writes about that. On April 25th, Li Peng and President Yang Shangkun reported to Deng Xiaoping about the Politburo Standing Committee meeting. Deng Xiaoping had always tended to prefer tough measures when dealing with student demonstrations because he believed that demonstrations undermined stability. After listening to their report, Deng immediately agreed to label the student demonstrations anti-party, anti-socialist turmoil and proposed to resolve the situation quickly in the manner of using a sharp knife to cut through knotted hemp. When I had visited him on April 19th, he had agreed with my position. On the 25th, after being briefed by Li Peng and Yang Shangkun, he had changed his mind and agreed with their assessment. After all, it coincided with what he had really believed all along. Before my visit to North Korea, neither Li Peng nor the cadres in Beijing mentioned these viewpoints to me. Immediately upon my leaving Beijing, they quickly held a Politburo Standing Committee meeting without me and gained support from Deng Xiaoping. Can you imagine if Xi Jinping left explicit instructions for you not to escalate a situation that was happening among protesters while he went to France or something to shake hands with Macron, and then he came back only to find that you had a secret level top meeting without him that completely contradicted what he had just told you to do? Can you imagine? Like, that just goes to show the difference between how power is concentrated today in China, not only in the sort of formalization of positions like general secretary and president or whatever, but in the way that there was more factionalization at the time. Like, this is a slight tangent. I've already been recording for over an hour at this point. This is a slight tangent. One of the things that Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign has also aimed to do is also undo factions within the party. And I think this episode with Zhao Ziyang is a good example of how factionalism used to actually work within the CCP, how intrigue used to work, how these events would unfold through like conversations, basically. Like, it's a bunch of old guys visiting each other in each other's houses and having conversations. It's basically Real Housewives of, I don't know, like Zhongnan High. It's not through force, right? It's through discussion. It's through political theory, like we saw with the Guofeng versus Deng Xiaoping episode. It's conversations, it's theory, it's politics, and it's very detailed politics, and it's so I don't know, like ephemeral almost. Like, if you're not looking at it, it's not even there to an extent. And it's just really fascinating to see it unfold and to see people so blithely say that they're going to do one thing and then just do another, and to openly gang up against people and try and actively, like, we're going to work together to like change Deng Xiaoping's mind. And it actually works as well, which is crazy, which is what we're getting onto next. Zhao Ziyang says something very interesting about Deng Xiaoping. He says that it was obvious that some people were attempting to use extreme words of a few students to aggravate the situation and push the government to the point of direct confrontation. However, selectively gathering all the personal criticisms and reading them aloud to Deng made for a tremendous insult to the old man. These people selected sporadic extreme opinions of a tiny minority of students and represented them to him as the major trend of the movement, which they claimed was directed specifically against Deng Xiaoping himself. Deng tended to think in a certain way that was formed during the years when the class struggle was the primary objective, so as soon as he heard Li Peng's report, he reacted accordingly. So this is where the Tiananmen Square incident as we know it starts really ramping up. Deng Xiaoping releases an editorial in which he calls the protests anti-party, anti-socialist, sort of like premeditated plots to bring down him and the CCP. Li Shenyan is calling for everyone to be arrested. Protesters are leaving wills to their families in case they never come back. It's all just it's a mess, right? And then Zhao Ziyang comes back from North Korea and is like, what have you done? Like, what did I just say? So there are hunger strikes. Zhao is going out to Tiananmen Square to plead with everybody to go home. Li Peng is being the enemy of progress and trying to blame everything on Zhao Ziyang. And it gets to the point where, you know, we've all seen those images of the troops trying to come into the city of Beijing and ordinary people kind of like blocking the way by either like lying in the street, or they're sending their children or their like grandmothers out. They're trying to stop the troops from coming in. They're like chatting with them, they're giving them food and whatever. The people are forming a people's blockade, if you will, to protect the students who are protesting. And it all gets to a point where Zhao Ziyang has had enough and he just takes a mental health break. He literally just is like, I'm going home for a little bit. I cannot deal with this. Everybody is acting crazy. I need a break. This was probably his biggest mistake, because by doing this, I don't know if he had like sensed where things were going in terms of the protests or in terms of politics, but I think this is where he kind of knows that his number is up, but it's not entirely clear. It's not what he says in his autobiography, so it's a bit hazy, but he's basically just like, I needed a break. Like, everyone was stressing me out. While he is on this mental health break, this is where a secret meeting is held without him, among other top leaders of the party, which according to Zhao is illegal because obviously he is a member of the Politburo Standing Committee and he's also General Secretary of the party, but whatever, obviously rules are not being followed right now. And this is where they actively plot Zhao's downfall. On the 20th of May, Deng called Chen Yun, Li Shenyan, Wang Zhen, Peng Zhen, Yang Shangkun, Li Peng, Qiao Shi, and Yao Yilin for a meeting at his house. Of course, I was not informed. I hear that in the meeting, Wang Zhen furiously vilified me as being a counter-revolutionary. Li Shenyan accused me of setting up a second headquarters. In the end, Deng decided to remove me from the post of General Secretary, but added that the announcement to the public should be delayed until after the completion of some necessary procedures. I was brushed aside just like that. And then the June 4th incident, known as the Tiananmen Square Incident or Tiananmen Square Massacre, takes place. And people are looking for someone to blame. And of course, Zhao Ziyang's enemies within the party take this as the opportunity not only to reroute blame onto Zhao, but also to get rid of him entirely, thus securing their hold over the party. Zhao, in his autobiography, describes a Politburo meeting that was held where he was formally dismissed. First, Li Peng, representing the 4 members of the Standing Committee, set the tone of the proceedings by giving a report that accused me of having committed the serious errors of splitting the party and supporting turmoil. He proposed that I be removed from my positions as General Secretary, Politburo member, and Politburo Standing Committee member. Afterwards, the participants took turns speaking, each expounding on those criticisms. The most vicious and slanderous personal attacks came from Li Shenyan. At the beginning of the criticism meeting, Deng Xiaoping was absent. Chen Yun also did not appear, but provided a written statement containing 2 lines. It had said that I had failed to meet the party's expectations and that he supported the party's decision to punish me. When the meeting was drawing to a close, I requested a chance to speak. Yao Yilin looked at his watch and said, "We've run out of time. If you must speak, keep it to under 10 minutes. I was upset. I said, after all this time in session to deal with my case, after 2 whole days of criticisms, how can you now allow me so little time to respond? As soon as I finished speaking, Yao Yilin abruptly adjourned the meeting. I immediately left the scene. No one else moved. It was obvious that they'd been instructed beforehand that they would be expected to express agreement with the displeasure with my speech and my attitude. The meeting resumed the next day. A vote was held to decide my case. They took out a statement that contained a resolution to strip me of all my official positions. After the 4th plenum of the 13th Central Committee, Cultural Revolution-style tactics that had been condemned and abandoned long ago were taken up to be used against me. These tactics included inundating the newspapers with critical articles, making me out to be an enemy, and a casual disregard of my personal freedoms. After this, Zhao Ziyang is kept under house arrest for basically the rest of his life when he dies in 2005. He is not allowed to attend the funerals of any of his friends and colleagues, including Deng Xiaoping. He is allowed a few meetings with family members, but always under tight supervision. He can go out and play golf occasionally, but, it's not the life he wanted to live. And as we know today, the events of June 4th and the entire Tiananmen series have been erased from sort of the public consciousness in China. And as part of this, Zhao Ziyang, his legacy, his memory, and his role are also kept hidden from the public. So I wanted to touch on a little bit Zhao Ziyang's political thought, because we talked a lot about how he was a reformer in the economic sphere and how he had a lot of opposition from the conservative members of the party who didn't want China to change, in that they didn't want the party's authoritarian control over China to change. And some of them had accused him of being more like Hu Yaobang. So what did that actually mean? Well, according to McFarquhar, Zhao confesses that as of the mid-1980s, he was an economic reformer and political conservative. Gradually, he came to realise that without political reform, the economic reform programme was in peril. For instance, the massive corruption would continue. By 1989, he was prepared to tell visiting Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that the position of the Chinese Communist Party would not change, but its method of governing had to. Rule of law had to replace rule by men. He wanted to increase transparency and to establish multiple channels of dialogue with various social forces. Moreover, he felt the social forces should be allowed to organise themselves rather than being required to submit to bodies led by the party state. Zhao wanted the possibility of choice, albeit limited, in elections to the national legislature. So this is what Zhao says that his opinions were during the 1980s. And as the autobiography goes on and we reach the final sections, this is what he says about sort of his closing thoughts as an old man thinking about politics. In fact, it is the Western parliamentary democratic system that has demonstrated the most vitality. It seems that this system is currently the best one available. This modernising involved both the market economy and democratic political system. In China, this would mean a long period of transition, one requiring two breakthroughs by the Communist Party, allowing competition from other parties and a free press, and making the party itself more democratic. Reform of the legal system and establishment of an independent judiciary would also take precedence. Zhao concludes with a brief disquisition, based on experience, on how difficult it would be to introduce such reforms. So, at the end of Zhao's life, we're kind of left with two sorts of questions about his legacy. I guess the first question would be, would he have actually supported liberal democracy, as he says here, had he never been put under house arrest? And if it were left up to somebody else to take over in Zhao's stead, would these reforms that he suggested ever have been possible to achieve anyway? In terms of the first question, I think that what I was trying to say with the rest of the episode in trying to illustrate the way in which the party was structured, the sort of backstabbing and infighting and factionalism and things like that, I think part of the purpose of that was to show that even the most idealistic, reform-minded leaders within China didn't have a snowball's chance in hell unless they had broad support from the rest of the party. It's great that we've got Xi Jinping now because he's like a perfect foil to Zhao Ziyang. Zhao Ziyang had almost no base, almost no support from other party members. He couldn't even save Hu Yaobang, whereas Xi Jinping has ultimate power. And if you go back to the Xi episode that I did, you will basically hear how Xi Jinping didn't just grab power for himself. It was the broad consensus of the party that brought him into power and continues to support his ideas, his language, his attitudes towards China and the rest of the world. Zhao Ziyang was in the opposite situation. He was actively fighting for his life and he lost. So even if the elders had retired, even if he managed to overcome other factions like Li Peng, he still would have had to deal with other conservatism within the party and also just the state of China at the time. China was still incredibly poor at this period of time. As we saw, many of the reforms that had started were rolled back and then they were brought back in the 90s. China was not in a stable position. It would have been as he said, a very long transition period, and he himself was already in his 70s by this point, so it's unlikely that he ever would have been able to see it through to the end. In terms of the second question, what chance would anyone have in succeeding in plans in turning China into a democratic state? I think Farquhar himself answers this question quite well. The story of Zhao's captivity prompts two reflections. If a patriotic official can only come to the conclusion that democracy was needed for China after years of nothing to do but think, what chance is there for a busy official today to have the leisure or the security to think such thoughts while on the job? And if he did manage to come to such a conclusion, how would he implement these ideas in the teeth of a party opposition at all levels of society? It took a disaster of cultural revolution proportions to shake China out of the Stalinist economic model. China doesn't need another cultural revolution, but the party would have to be shaken to its roots for its leaders to contemplate the following final message of Zhao Ziyang's testament. But we can never really know what would have happened had Zhao never been deposed and exiled, had Hu Yaobang lived, had the conservative factions been overthrown, because, as Mao Zedong himself writes, there is only one truth, and who discovered the truth, not by subjective exaggeration, but by objective practice. Only the revolutionary practice of millions of people is the yardstick for testing the truth. So that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. That was kind of like... that was just me trying to express who Zhao Ziyang was. That's a homage to Zhao Ziyang, his memory, his ideas, his ideals. So yeah, I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I'm not great on social media, but there is social media. All the links are somewhere in the description of the audio or video if you're watching on YouTube. Also, please follow me on Substack. I do writing on Substack. That's a little bit more, I guess, political. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee where I put the transcripts of these episodes up so you can see all of my sources and you can see how I write it and everything. There is a script. I'm not just like doing all of this from memory. And yeah, that's it from me. So I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.